There is just one story this morning, the dramatic end of the Gorbachev era in the Soviet Union.
She was one of Britain's most high-profile television presenters at the pinnacle of her career when she was shot down in cold blood outside her house in London.
I felt completely numb, really, in many respects. It was just the most extraordinary piece of information I think I've ever been given.
Her killer left the scene without a trace.
It was a ruthless murder. He went right up to her, pushed her down onto the step so that she was kneeling, placed a gun to her temple and fired a single shot.
The execution of Jill Dando sent shockwaves through the nation and sparked the country's largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper.
For the first few days, almost whole editions of newspapers were filled with this story and nothing else.
More than 2 decades on, the murder of Jill Dando remains a mystery.
Could be almost anyone, we just don't know who he is.
On the 26th of April 1999, BBC television presenter Jill Dando was shot by a single bullet to the head on the doorstep of her home in southwest London. The hunt for her killer prompted the biggest murder inquiry ever conducted by the Metropolitan Police. 2 years later, after a controversial court case, local resident Barry George was found guilty of the killing. But during a dramatic retrial, he was cleared of Jill Dando's murder. So who shot one of Britain's best-loved television personalities? This is the story of the brutal slaying of Jill Dando, told from the inside through the eyewitness accounts from those closest to the story. Born in Weston-super-Mare, Jill Dando began her journalism career as a reporter on the local paper, the Western Mercury. Determined to work in broadcasting, she eventually went on to become a presenter for BBC South West. She quickly rose to become a household name when she moved to the BBC's national news operation in London, presenting the breakfast news and the 6 o'clock news. But she was best known as the face of the hit shows Holiday and Crimewatch, a series that explored unsolved criminal investigations. Above all, Jill Dando was renowned for her down-to-earth charm that endeared her to millions of viewers.
Didn't matter whether she was doing Crimewatch or the news or the holiday programme and the other things she did. She had a warmth and sincerity about her, which is not really something you can learn. It's just the way you are. And I think Jill had that connection with the public that made them feel like she was their sister or their auntie and part of their family.
Jill Dando was one of the most popular people on television. She was kind of a darling of the BBC. She presented mainstream programmes like Holiday and Crimewatch, and she had a really, I guess, very pleasing personality that people really responded to. She was, people felt that when she was presenting programmes as if she was talking to them through the screen, and that was a great gift that she had.
When she moved to Fulham, she lived in the next road to where I live, and we would always bump into each other in the local shops, in the street, and that's how we would chat and catch up.
She was great fun, had a fabulous sense of humour, but very serious and professional when she needed to be, and she was just a great person to be around. Throughout, certainly my years on Crimewatch, it was always a very close-knit team, and Jill fitted into that perfectly.
It was another young woman who was going to be the face of Britain at the millennium. So she was the embodiment, in a sense, of the BBC.
As well as enjoying a successful TV career, Jill had recently announced her engagement to Dr. Alan Farthing.
She was getting married, she was talking about Alan and the wedding and getting excited about organising everything, and she had so much to look forward to, so much fun, happiness in her life.
I remember bumping into her when she came back from Sydney, when she'd been on holiday, and she was totally in love.
The pair had met on a blind date at a dinner party in 1997. They became engaged in February 1999 and were due to marry that same year. To her friends and colleagues, Jill was as happy as she'd ever been, and she shared with them her desire to become a mother. On the 26th of April 1999, Jill Dando had spent the night at Alan Farthing's home in Chiswick.
Jill left her fiancé's house in Chiswick. I think it was about 7 or 8 in the morning. The plan was that she would go from the house to, I think she had a fashion shoot at lunchtime, a job she was doing, and then in the afternoon she was planning to go to a fitting for her wedding dress.
Miss Dando had been going to her house purely to get changed. She was no longer living there. She was living with a boyfriend several miles away.
Jill lived on Gowan Avenue in Fulham, southwest London.
So Gowan Avenue, typical residential street, quite middle class, lots of comings and goings, a typical morning, a very ordinary morning, nothing unexpected appeared to be going on. People taking their children to school, the postman coming down the road, neighbours coming and going.
When she bought her home in Fulham and was so thrilled about it, she told me that one of the reasons she'd chosen that home was that it had a hedge and it had a tree that afforded her privacy.
Having left her fiancé's home in Chiswick, Jill made various stops on her way home, including a brief visit to the petrol station, Kings Mall shopping centre in Hammersmith, and a fishmonger's on Fulham Road. It was around 11:30 a.m. when Jill finally arrived at Gowan Avenue.
She got out of her car, having parked it, and in fact, still had the keys to the car in her hand.
As Jill was about to approach her front door, she was unaware that somebody was closely watching her every movement. As she looked for her house keys in her bag, she was approached from behind and shot once in the head. The BBC's golden girl, Jill Dando, was the TV star everybody loved. She was full of excitement at her future plans to marry Dr. Alan Farthing and start a family. But these plans would never bear fruit. Having spent the previous night at her fiancé's house in Chiswick, on the morning of the 26th of April 1999, Jill Dando was shot dead on the doorstep of her Fulham home.
It was very unusual to see Jill's car parked in the road because she was living with her fiancé in Chiswick at that point. I thought, oh, I might see Jill as she comes out of her front door. So as I approached her home, I deliberately looked at her front door, and there's a very tiny pathway from the pavement where I was to her front door. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
What it seemed to have happened was that Jill Dando had gone to her home address, albeit she wasn't living there anymore, and it would seem that she was attacked and shot effectively on a doorstep just prior to entering her house.
It was a ruthless murder. It wasn't done, the shooting wasn't from a distance. The killer wasn't standing at the gate, he wasn't sort of leaning out of a car, he went right up to her, pushed her down onto the step so that she was kneeling, placed a gun to her temple and fired a single shot.
There was no time to prepare. From one step to the next, everything changed because I was witness to an incredibly violent scene. At first, it was difficult in the first few seconds to realise it was actually Jill, and she was actually in that position on her doorstep, leaning against her front door. She had changed colour, there was a lot of blood loss, and instinctively, it was clear to me that she was dead. I looked around, there was nobody else in the street, and I quickly got my mobile phone to call the emergency services. When I was talking to the emergency services, I said that I thought that she had been stabbed because of the blood loss. It didn't occur to me at that point that it would have been a gun crime. And I added in the conversation, confidentially, it's Jill Dando.
Shocked and distressed, Helen didn't want to be alone.
I remember that I'd seen a neighbour who lives near me. So I ran down the road and knocked on the person's door. My neighbour came to the scene. She took one look and said, "She looks as if she's dead," and ran off further up the road to a doctor's surgery. So I was left on my own again at the scene looking at Jill, who was lifeless on her own doorstep.
The police were first to arrive.
They just went through the gate and started dealing with Jill. They pretty quickly bundled me and the other two, the doctor's receptionist and my neighbour, into Jill's neighbour's home.
Soon after, the paramedics arrived, and then the air ambulance. Jill Dando was taken to Charing Cross Hospital.
She was certified dead at 1:03 p.m.
The BBC television presenter Jill Dando has been murdered outside her London home.
A man was seen leaving from outside number 29 Gowan Avenue, and he ran east down this road towards the Fulham Palace Road.
Detectives are now trying to establish a motive for the murder. Our correspondent Fergus Walsh.
I felt completely numb, really, in many respects. It was just the most extraordinary piece of information I think I've ever been given.
In this country, although there are a lot of shootings, they're usually linked to the underworld, crime gangs, teenage gangs. But a lady like this, shot on a doorstep in a West London street, a nice West London street, very respectable, quite well-heeled, was extraordinary.
The image that really is very, very difficult is her beautiful engagement ring with all that hope in it on a very dead hand. Just snuffed out.
Scotland Yard launched into action with Operation Oxborough, the largest criminal investigation since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper.
Regardless of who the victim is, there needs to be a methodical approach to the inquiry. It was just because of the victim, in this case, being such a high-profile celebrity, that everything was increased. For the first few days, almost whole editions of newspapers were filled with this story and nothing else.
Also important to put this in some perspective, because the London police were on the alert searching for the now bomber, David Copeland. And so there was a huge amount of police activity around London and a lot of news media concentration on that issue, because there'd already been two now bombs, one in Brick Lane, one in Brixton, and there was a great deal of concern about where this now bomber was going to strike again and what the reaction would be.
With unprecedented media attention surrounding the police investigation and the victim's high-profile status, the homicide squad came under immense public scrutiny. They faced their first hurdle with a forensic examination of the crime scene.
Yeah, one of the main problems that the police had was that it had been quite severely compromised by the medical services that had been there, by them removing her body once it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done, created some problems. Very little was obtained from that scene. What they had done, I can't criticise that, because I assumed that everything was being done to try and save Miss Dando's life at the time.
There was nothing that came out from the scene other than the fact they, of course, had the bullet which had killed Jill Dando, which was quite unusual. It was crimped, it had been pressed in. They used 50 search officers going down the surrounding streets, and they took up the drains, they looked at the sewers, They looked all along the riverbank by the park in case that the government might just have tossed the gun over a hedge or threw it into a drain.
We can't be sure, obviously, about the gun that was used because it's never been recovered. But the thinking was that it was in some way a reactivated gun or one that had in some way been adapted.
After the forensic examination of the crime scene proved fruitless, the detectives turned their attention to examining witness statements.
There was no eyewitness to the actual offence. Several witnesses gave information about a man who was present at the scene before and immediately after. And one of the main focuses of the inquiry was to identify this person.
Richard, her neighbour, said that he had heard her set her car alarm and that he had heard a scream, looked out of the window, and he'd seen somebody go past further down Gowan Avenue.
One of the problems that the team was faced with was the unprecedented amount of information that was being received within the incident room. During the course of the inquiry, over 2,000 people were named as being responsible or in some way involved in Miss Dando's murder. Without a clear witness or without a clear motive and reason, stranger murders are by definition the most difficult to investigate.
In a cruel twist of fate, detectives turned to the very programme Jill had presented in a bid to find her killer.
You never imagine in your wildest dreams the idea that you would ever have, or we would ever have had to make an appeal about somebody we knew so well. There was a pressure on us to think that we could do something to help, to use the programme and to use our experience to try and help in some way. And I think everyone was actually really relieved that they could feel that they could do something. The appeal itself to find information regarding Jill's killer produced a lot of phone calls.
Several witnesses saw a man in the area earlier in the morning. And then there are various sightings of a man in a sort of waxed jacket. We have somebody who saw what they described as a sweating man at a bus stop. We have another sweating man seen in Fulham Palace Park, or Fulham Park, which is opposite, quite close to Gowan Avenue, who was talking on a mobile phone. So there are lots of different little sort of sightings, but nobody actually saw the attack.
One of the main purposes of the inquiry is to try and separate the potential suspect from other people.
And I think as the months went on, it was quite apparent that this was going to be a long investigation.
As the police inquiry continued, the funeral of Jill Dando took place at Clarence Park Baptist Church in Weston-super-Mare. Mourners lined the streets to watch the 3-mile cortege.
I was not able to attend Jill's funeral. I did go to her Thanksgiving at All Souls in Langham Place, which was like the funeral for me. And I can remember trying not to cry at that, because it was definitely a thanksgiving for her life.
A grieving nation mounted pressure on the police to bring Jill's killer to justice.
What we needed to be sure of, was she followed, wasn't she followed? There was a small and dedicated group of officers that meticulously went through every scrap of footage that we had during the course of the inquiry. What we can categorically say is that from the meticulous examination of the footage from 191 cameras, she wasn't followed at all to that address.
They also searched through 80,000 mobile phone records for the Fulham area and also for Chiswick, which could in some way be linked to her death. Either somebody following her who passed on a message that she was on her way home, or somebody who was waiting and got the message that she was arriving. None of those phone calls produced any evidence either.
The months rolled by, but no leads emerged, and police were struggling to gather any significant evidence.
Her file of facts had 486 names in it, and they went through every name and address they could find. They looked at her fiancé's background and drew a blank on that.
I realised that on day one, I was probably on a list of potential suspects being first on the scene. That's a normal thing. The nearest and dearest of a victim are always scrutinised, and I knew that I would be too.
Because of the nature of who Miss Dando was and her work, it was hard to ascertain a definitive motive as to why someone would conceivably want to kill her.
Obviously, one of the lines of inquiry was the possibility that there had been a stalker or somebody with an unhealthy interest in Jill Dando who might have come along and killed her.
Like a lot of celebrities, she'd attracted a lot of unhealthy interest. They found, for example, that one man had tried to acquire her BT account and run it unknown to her, but which would allow him to look at her phone calls or phone numbers. They found that somebody else had 150 pictures on his, of her collected on his computer. Another man had attempted to take over her utility bills, electricity, gas, water. Extraordinary behaviour by some of these people. But the police looked at about 4,000 people, I think it was, of whom about 150 seemed to have what they would describe as an unhealthy interest in her. But at the end of the day, none of these had showed any evidence of taking their interest further than a fantasy or a fixation.
In April 1999, the television presenter Jill Dando was shot dead as she entered her house in Fulham, southwest London. The brutal nature of the execution-style murder shocked the nation. Initial police inquiries had failed to find any evidence. There was no murder weapon, no evidence at the scene, and crucially, police were unable to find a motive for her killing. But as the investigation reached its first anniversary, police turned their attention to a man well known in the area, Barry Michael George.
George had a conviction for a sex attack in the 1980s. He also discovered that there was a reference on his file to the fact he'd been arrested in the grounds of one of the royal palaces with a length of rope around his shoulder and a knife. And the palace concern was the one where the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana were then living. And they found that he'd been stopped by police in the 1990s for following women. Nobody at Fulham Police Station actually knew anything about him, interestingly. Barry George turned out to be a very long way down the suspect list.
He was described as a loner, and he was almost a usual, one of the usual suspects, because the police hadn't found anybody and they came back to him.
Barry George had been reported to the police in the early days following Jill's murder.
A detective constable called John Gallagher discovered a message about a man called Busara, which had come in from Hafad, which was a local drop-in centre for disabled people, very close to the scene of the shooting, in which they said that this man, Busara, had seemed very agitated and they were concerned about him. The policeman did some checking and found that Busara cross-referred to Barry George.
Barry George often claimed he was the cousin of British musician Freddie Mercury and used the alias Barry Bulsara.
To some extent, he was living in a fantasy world, especially in relation to Queen and music and all the rest of it. But this is it. It was an overtly fantastical world where, he wasn't hiding away.
He pretended that he was the cousin of the singer or the musician in the Electric Light Orchestra, that his name was Paul Gadd, which is in fact the real name of Gary Glitter. and he had a name, Steve Majors, that he also used, and he pretended he was in the SAS, and that seems to have been an amalgam of Lee Majors, the actor, and Steve Austin, the $6 million man from the television programme. So because of all these different names, and because many of the people had phoned in to the police about him anonymously and not giving a name, it took the police several months to connect all these incidents and realise that they were all sightings of the same person.
I think most people who lived in Fulham were aware of Barry George wandering around the streets. He's quite distinctive. He was somebody who probably needed a little bit more help than he had in the community.
But further examination of statements given to police during the early days of the investigation began to reveal more.
By now, police were getting very concerned because they also knew, looking through their records, that a local taxi firm had also called the police soon after the shooting to say they were concerned about a man who kept coming in and seemed to be trying to build up what, as it appeared to the police, to be constructing an alibi for himself.
Timings were crucial, of course, because the killing took place at around 11:30 in the morning. Question, where was he? And his case was that he'd attended at a local agency, Hafad, housing agency, and that he'd gone home and changed clothing, and he'd gone to a park and gone to get a taxi somewhere else. And so his defensive alibi was that he wasn't in the road when it happened.
An investigation into his past revealed that Barry George had a history of unusual behaviour. He suffered from a personality disorder, had a fixation with celebrities, and was known locally to follow and photograph women.
There was one case of, I think it was a woman in a bus queue, and then he got on the bus with her. Now, this is very overt behaviour. In other words, it is somebody who is, I think, desperately anxious to create a relationship, which he hasn't got, with somebody. And so it's an unhappy situation, and it's very unpleasant, I suspect, for any woman who is on the receiving end of this treatment. And in a sense, he needs help if that's what was going on. But this is a long way away from the nature of this crime, which wasn't about following Jill Dando around in order to create a relationship.
The psychological profilers were talking about somebody who might well fantasize, who might, for example, have fantasized over Princess Diana, somebody who'd had difficult relationships in the past, which Barry George had had. All of these things added to the list of things that ticked off that made him a very strong suspect, and then eventually the strongest suspect.
More than 12 months on from Jill's murder, the Metropolitan Police arrested Barry George at his flat.
4 unarmed officers, or that is what Scotland Yard still maintains, arrested him, and they began a search of his home. And that is when things became interesting.
No, I mean, Barry George's flat was absolutely stacked to the ceiling with old newspapers. You could barely get in it. So he, again, might be regarded as an oddball for keeping all these newspaper cuttings and so on. But, so, yes, there was a sort of obsessive side to this man because he collected things, but I know lots of people who collect things. Maybe not to that extent. Obsessive of Jill Dando? Absolutely not. You know, you would think that if he was obsessed with Jill Dando, he would have accumulated quite a library, because she was in the newspapers very regularly. None of it was cut out. None of it was highlighted. There were no notes anywhere suggesting he was wanting to find out where Jill Dando was at any one time.
They took a coat that he'd worn and sent it for examination. They developed about 100 reels of film which he had, which showed that he'd been stalking around about, I think it's 480 women.
The police investigation also revealed that he had an interest in firearms. Barry George was interviewed at Hammersmith Police Station in London.
This is a man who originally had told the police that he had nothing to do with guns and hadn't had anything to do with guns for quite a long time. But police found that, for example, he tried to join the parachute regiment, the TA section of it. He tried to join the regular army. He belonged for a short time to a gun club in Kensington. He'd had a number of starter pistols. A former neighbour of his had seen him with a weapon.
After he was arrested, it was plain he did have an interest in firearms. I mean, he didn't have the weapon that is said to have been used here, but he did have an interest in weapons. But that doesn't mean that he's the murderer.
He said he had nothing to do with Jill Dando. He didn't know Jill Dando lived in the area. He'd never met her, never seen her, and denied any link at all to the murder.
Barry George was asked to take part in an ID parade.
He refused to go on an ID parade, and so the ID parades were done on a laptop with potential witnesses being shown a series of images of possible suspects plus innocent people, and picking them out from a laptop display.
There was a neighbour living right next door to Jill Dando who was looking out on the road, and a man living opposite. They both saw somebody departing from the gate area where this had happened. And they both went to identification parades, and neither of them picked out Barry George. In fact, either one or both picked out someone else.
Whilst Barry George was being held in custody, forensics made a discovery that would change the course of the investigation.
Everything gelled for the police when they were told by the forensic science experts that they had found a very, very tiny trace of firearms discharge in the pocket of the coat that had been taken away. It was said to measure around about 0.5 of an inch. It was tiny.
Remember, we're talking about a year after the shooting, and it matched the firearms residue at the scene.
But the interesting thing about it was that the chemical composition, according to the scientists, was exactly the same as the bullet which had killed Jill Dando.
They also found a single fibre at the crime scene that matched the material on a pair of trousers owned by prime suspect Barry George. On the 29th of May 2000, Barry George was formally charged with the murder of Jill Dando.
There was a lot of press interest in him. Obviously, because identification was a key issue in the case, and the police were very keen that lots of pictures of him didn't appear. And that was slightly odd because at the very beginning of the trial, the court then gave permission for pictures to be released, and there was this huge amount of coverage about him at the start of the trial, all these different images of him, and it was considered that was quite sort of prejudicial towards him, really.
Barry George's trial for the murder of Jill Dando got underway at the Old Bailey in February 2001. It was a trial that would captivate the nation and prove to be one of the most controversial cases in British criminal history. He pleaded not guilty.
A trial at the Old Bailey for anyone is a pressured event, especially if it's in one of the old courts, which it was, because they've held many famous trials. Certainly most of the UK press and media were there on a daily basis. So the court was full of people interested in the result.
During the trial, the prosecution presented George as a lone gunman with stalker tendencies. But his defence counsel painted a different picture.
We tried to present Barry George, obviously as the person that he was, just very vulnerable person, living in the locality, relatively well known in the locality, who had an alibi, which he'd obviously produced to the jury, and basically as somebody who, in a sense, wasn't capable of carrying out this murder.
The case against Barry George centred on forensic evidence.
The gun residue was clearly the key issue because it linked, according to the prosecution, it directly linked Barry George to a gun, to the murder.
You have to remember, no firearms residue was found in his flat or found in anything else to do with him. So if he's supposed to be adapting weapons or playing around with weapons, Where was he doing? He certainly wasn't doing it in his flat. He didn't own lots of flats all over London. One had to examine the possibility that it had got there through an accident of continuity. In other words, it was contamination.
The prosecution relied heavily on the identification evidence. They relied on a fibre which they found, which they said linked Barry George's trouser to Jill Dando, that the fibre had come off the trousers and onto her clothing.
This case depended largely on circumstantial evidence, and plainly, from a prosecution point of view, forensic scientific evidence can be rather more compelling than any other.
It was circumstantial, and they admitted it was circumstantial, but the judge and the prosecution both said that it was possible to convict on the basis of circumstantial evidence without, for example, a confession, without an eyewitness who had actually seen a gun used, without the gun itself, without a motive.
After a trial lasting 5 weeks, a jury of 6 women and 5 men found Barry George guilty of the murder of Jill Dando, and he was sentenced to life in prison.
I was very upset, I was very angry, the fact that he'd been convicted. I had plenty of time to think back over the trial and say, well, what's gone wrong here? How did this jury come to that conclusion? I think it's probably a combination of somebody who kind of looked odd in the dock, somebody who looked odd, which fitted the publicity that had gone before. Secondly, I think there was pressure on this jury, feeling that the nature of the crime was so heinous that, you know, here was an odd man and he lived in the area and there was a firearms particle. And they put that together, I think.
Despite the verdict, Barry George always protested his innocence. And as he began his sentence, there was growing unease at the decision to find him guilty.
From that point on, people began to get behind Barry George, to campaign for a fresh look at the case, and arguing that there was something wrong here, that it was a miscarriage of justice. His defence managed to mount an appeal. As the years went on and Barry George remained in prison, a campaign built up to get him free.
Eventually, new forensic research cast doubt over the significance of the gunpowder traces used to initially convict George, and the case went to a retrial.
The Court of Appeal had argued that if the evidence in the pocket had been found a day or so after the murder, then it was key evidence. There was a link. But because there had been such a long period of time, it was no longer safe to assume it was linked to the murder.
The forensic evidence was deemed unsafe, and after 8 years in prison, Barry George was finally cleared of the murder of Jill Dando.
The prosecution maintained that he was an obsessionist with a fantasy about guns and a grudge against the BBC. The defence simply said, what we have here is the police have arrested the local nutter. And that was the phrase used by William Clegg QC, who now appeared for Barry George. And the jury accepted that there wasn't sufficient evidence.
Because I'm a firm believer that the truth will out in the end and justice will be done, but some people have to wait far longer than he did. And to give him his due, it's his persistence, his self-belief that got him acquitted.
In 2007, an appeal court deemed the evidence used to convict Barry George as inadmissible, and the following year, at a retrial that lasted 8 weeks, his conviction was quashed. He was released from prison in August 2008, having spent 8 years behind bars for a crime he had now been acquitted of. But more than 20 years on, the murder of Jill Dando seems as inexplicable as the day her body was found on the doorstep of her Fulham home. The acquittal of Barry George left many unanswered questions. Chief amongst them, if it wasn't Barry George, just who else would want to kill Jill Dando?
It all comes back to why was she actually attacked? Whoever did it had to know she lived there. Whoever did it took steps to make sure that nobody tried to stop them leaving. Had to have had a weapon, which they had loaded and ready to use.
I mean, I believed throughout the case, because of the nature of the evidence and the window of opportunity, it had to have been carried out by a professional.
Some theories linked Jill's murder to her job as presenter of Crimewatch.
So there were a number of theories that emerged in the aftermath of Barry George's acquittal. And I guess into this vacuum, all these theories came. And one of them was that Jill could have been shot by the IRA. And I think that has its origins in somebody in a prison cell saying that they'd heard this story, that because of her Crimewatch association, that somehow or other the IRA were concerned that she might identify some members, and so that they had, put out a hit on her, as it were. That was very similar to the suggestion of a North London crime family who also was said to have been outraged by her interest, or Crimewatch's interest, in their activities. And so it was suggested that they too had put out a hit on her. Maybe those theories have some weight, but the police would have investigated them.
Another theory mentioned by Barry George's legal team suggested that Jill Dando may have been assassinated by a Serbian hitman.
There was the possibility that her death had been linked to the Kosovan war, because she made an appeal on behalf of the Kosovans, and a few days before, the Belgrade TV station used by the Serbs had been bombed by the NATO allies, and this could be a tit for tat.
I know that there was another theory in relation to her death which seemed to have gained some credence on social media, that she had been investigating a VIP paedophile ring, or had been told about the existence of such a ring of people, and that had prompted her investigation, and that the ring had conspired to kill her so that they wouldn't be exposed by her inquiries.
There wasn't a clear explanation. It wasn't a sex attack, it wasn't a robbery. It was an assassination of some description, and that left people very, very puzzled.
The fact remains that Jill Dando's next-door neighbour looked out of the window after what was the shooting and saw somebody leaving, closing her front gate and setting off down the road. So this person could be anyone. He could be the hitman from the North London crime family. He could be the IRA assassin. He could be the Serbian hitman who's been sent over from Belgrade. Could be almost anyone. We just don't know who he is.
What we were all conscious of throughout the inquiry was what a senseless crime this was, and the feeling of shock to a degree throughout the country never really diminished.
My own view is that the person who was responsible was the person that was seen in the street multiple times that day, who has never been identified. And I think it's highly unlikely that they were a hired assassin or a contract killer. I think it was, the stalker, loner, obsessive type person who had an interest in guns, who had an interest in television, celebrities. They don't have any connection to Jill Dando, probably, and therefore it's going to be incredibly hard to identify them.
More than 2 decades on from her murder, Jill's legacy lives on with her friends and colleagues.
Jill Dando's name will live on because the BBC founded a scholarship for her, in her name, for a young media trainee. And there is an Institute of Criminology named after her, which has actually been very successful.
When something like this happens, for everybody, whole communities, to feel sucked in and feel grief and distress and fear about something like that. But you do have to take a step back and look at the perspective of it, and it was a unique event. It was just extraordinary, and please God, nothing ever like this happens again.